Alright, so this is part 2 of the video series on mastering filters. Yes, it's another video about filters, but this one will be dedicated to answering the questions that some of you sent over on Instagram and on Facebook so that I can hopefully help you understand filters better and get you more confident when you shoot landscapes out there in the field. Of course, prior to this, I did post the first part of the mastering filters video, which you can check out here. And hopefully you've already watched that so that some of the clarifications you're going to get from this video will also complement what you got from the first one. Okay, let's get right onto the questions. And I do have to start, of course, with the one question that is most commonly asked whenever I do one of these and also whenever I give talks about landscape photography. And this particular question comes from two people on the thread. Number one is Dar Paulo and number two is GinoBer16. So they're asking, what filter would you recommend to beginners? Now, this is when you ask me anything about recommending anything to beginners, it's always a loaded question because, of course, my answer is always a question as well. And it's basically, what do you want to accomplish? But without that context, I'll try to give my suggestion. So if you're a beginner who has absolutely no experience shooting with filters, who wants to start shooting and try things out, considering that you're probably also within a certain budget, then I would suggest you get this one filter. Now, there are many variants from different brands, but I personally have this one to show you. This one is a combination filter, which is basically a CPL and an ND1000 or a 10-stop ND. And basically, if you've watched the first video, it's going to tell you that it's a 10-stop ND and basically multiplies your shutter speed or your exposure time by 1000. Actually, it's 1024. So the 10-stop ND can allow you from a split second to about 30 seconds depending on how bright the situation is. Now, of course, there are many other variants. There are variants that are 3 stops, for example. But if you're gonna have just one, I would rather you get the darker one simply because you're gonna have a bit more room to experiment. You can shoot with this filter during noontime, even if it's very bright out. And you can also shoot with this during sunset. So it's something that does not limit you as much as the others. If you get an ND8, for example, you can use it, but you might not be able to do the longer exposures that you might want to be trying. You can't go mainly beyond 10 seconds or more with an ND8. Unless, of course, you're shooting when it's about to get dark already, which is kind of limiting as well in terms of the time that you can use the filter. On the other hand, if you get a 15 stop or a 20 stop, you're only going to get to use that in the heaviest daylight, meaning at noon when there aren't any clouds or very little clouds in the sky and there is maximal brightness and you can do very long exposures. So this is kind of the middle ground. Plus, this one from Mecco Filters has the benefit of an additional CPL, which means that you get 2 filters in one. So basically, you have a CPL to help you with your reflections and also help you increase the intensity of the blue skies. At the same time, you can do long exposures, the length depending on how bright the situation is. And of course, using this should be guided by the things I said on the first video. Okay, question number 2. This one is coming from my good friend Justin Espejo. And he actually asked 2 questions. So first one, he wants me to explain color casts. Now, color casts are basically flaws in the quality of the filters that you get. Now, there are filters with almost zero color cast, and there are filters with heavy color cast. And of course, if you buy a cheap ND filter, you can expect that it might be the one with the heavier color cast and also generally a worse quality in glass. And the reason why there are more expensive filters in the market is because they were made to have little to no color cast at all. Now, what is the problem with color cast? Of course, any filter that you use is basically an additional layer of glass to your lens. No matter how expensive your lens is, no matter how pristine the glass quality is, your filter will be on the frontmost and it will affect the image quality. And another reason why there are higher quality filters is because they have the least effect in terms of degrading the sharpness. Because again, it's always just having an effect on the image quality. But the worst filters, of course, also have an effect on the color. Now, there are filters with considerable color cast, but still enough to be reversed in post processing, whether it be for video or photo. The ones you want to avoid are, of course, the terrible ones that cannot be reversed or cannot be edited out. And most of the time, the color cast comes in two situations. Number one, when you're using a really heavy ND filter, say a 10 stop or even a 12, 15, or a 20. And of course, the denser the tint on the ND filter, the more probability of having some colors casted. And the other one, which is for me the litmus paper test of color cast and filters, is when there is direct sunlight hitting the filter itself. And the sunlight is generally something that kind of brings out the color cast if there is. And that's a way that you can judge the filter that you are testing out or something, of course, you probably already bought. Now, there are no perfect filters, but there are brands, of course, that create much better filters. And I do believe that I'm working with one of the best filter brands, which is HNY. Not just because of the quality of the glass and the little to no color cast at all, but also because of the innovation in terms of the filter holder system. They created the first magnetic filter holder, especially the ones for square filters, and of course they also have the amazing Revo ring. And I do have an affiliate link down below, but this video was not sponsored by them. This is out of pure love of the brand HNY. So yeah, when it comes to color cast, it's a matter of managing the color cast if there are any. And most times it's not going to be much of a problem, unless of course you buy the filters that cost maybe $5 each. So you're not going to expect anything good out of that. Remember, if you're investing on gear, especially if you're serious about landscape photography, you get what you pay for. Generally, you get what you pay for. So if you settle with second-rate filters, you're gonna have to expect that you're gonna deal with some color cast and also maybe some other glass quality problems when it comes to absorbing moisture, when it comes to, of course, the durability of the filters, and altogether the experience of using the filters, especially when you're working with a lot of them. Okay, on to Justin's second question, and honestly, this made me giggle quite a bit. Why are the square ones super kaduper expensive? Honestly, I don't think they are. It's just that you might be looking at the cheaper circular filters, which are technically all over the place. And it's made by every other manufacturer, and there's a price range on every single one. The thing is, the cheaper brands, you're probably not going to be able to find any square filters coming from them. And if they do, you're going to have to question the quality as well. The reason why you might think that the square filters are more expensive is because it's mainly the bigger and the better brands that create the good quality ones and that create them altogether. So there's a bit of a bias in terms of how you see these brands because you might think they're expensive, but actually they're the only ones who make them because they are the ones that cater to more serious and more experienced photographers. Okay, this next question comes from Visions of Nicco. Nice name, by the way. Cheap lens filter on an expensive lens? Would you recommend it? Yes and no. Of course, if you have the budget for an expensive lens, you probably also have the budget for a good filter. And let's take the price out of the question, just choose something of good quality. And generally, of course, if you have a good lens, you're going to want to pair it with a good filter. And the problem there, of course, no one's going to stop you from using cheaper filters. No one's going to judge you from using cheaper filters. It depends on, it's your life, it's your story, it's your gear. But I always say that you shouldn't compromise when it comes to quality of filters if you're serious about landscape photography, because it's going to lead to some regret in the end. Take it from me, I started with some really cheap filters. And I did take some shots that I really loved at the time. But now when I look at them, and there's terrible color cast, and there was a lot of degradation in terms of the image quality, I wish I just bought the better filters because I really do not have a way of buying back those images that should have been much better. So it's all a matter of regretting the poor quality you might be working with. But of course, if you're under a budget, there are better filters that are also affordable. So it doesn't mean that you have to buy the most expensive one. It's just that you have to be cautious with the quality of the filters you get. Okay, this next question comes from Kim Claiborne. How to choose appropriate filters for a particular scene or location? Short answer, watch the previous video because I explained a lot there. But the gist of it is that you don't choose a filter for a location. You don't choose a filter for a certain scene. Instead, you choose a filter for the effect that you intend to have. So it's important to know what each filter will do to your exposures, and at the same time, it's important to know what these exposures will do to the scene. So you're not choosing depending on the location, if you're shooting from a mountaintop or from the beach or whatever. You're shooting depending on what is moving and what you want to come out of it. Now, 2 questions from AJD. The first one is tips on proper exposure when using ND for long exposures. Now, this is something I explained on the first video in quite a bit of detail and also talked about the mathematical formula. So I'm rather proud of it. So I do hope you check out that video if you haven't. And again, the gist of everything is the length of your exposure is going to depend on your base exposure and the number of stops the ND filter you're using has. So that will be the determinant. So if you use the formula, you can somehow calculate. But again, there are also apps that are available. I use the one by Myops. And you don't really have to compute every single time. And honestly, most of the time, what I do is just play it by ear. So when you've been shooting a lot with filters and you take your base exposure, somewhere along the way, you're just gonna have that sixth sense with filters. So at first, it's gonna be tricky. You're gonna be computing or you're gonna be doing trial and error. But later on, it's going to be an easier process for you because you can somehow approximate and just estimate the exposure. But of course, if you do it mathematically, then there are less chances for missed exposures. So it's totally up to you, but generally the best tip for this is get used to shooting with filters and you'll find your way. Now his next question is about the proper way of stacking filters. Now there are some tips. I've read a lot about different ways of stacking filters, and generally the most accepted is that you put the darker filter closer to the lens. And this is generally because it's just gonna help your camera focus better if you're using autofocus. And the more important tip is that you have to set a limit on the number of filters you're going to stack. Again, no matter how good your filter is, it's still an extra glass layer in front of your lens. So there is an effect on image quality. So if you put maybe 5, 6, or 7 layers of glass, then there is, of course, going to be a considerable amount of effect on the image quality. And of course, you also have to be wary about the vignetting that comes from the multiple layers of filters, and that depends on the lens that you're using. For example, if you're using a wide angle like this one, you're going to be able to use maybe 3 or 4 layers at most. So it's also good to be able to really think about the filters that you're actually going to need, so you can kind of decrease the number of layers you're going to stack when you're shooting. And of course, when you're shooting with circular filters, more often than not, you can use less layers because the circular filters usually cost more vignette, because the size or the diameter of the filter is very close to the diameter of your lens, as compared to when you're using square filters. Generally, there's a bit more space from the barrel of the lens altogether. Now, last question. This came from Facebook. It's from Ryan Bukayu, and he's asking, if your budget only allows you to have one graduated ND filter, what will you buy? Easy answer, get a soft GND. Of course, the hard GND and the reverse GND, they have that specific charm when it comes to certain situations. And this is generally when you're shooting horizons that are empty, meaning that there is no foreground element that is protruding from the ground crossing the horizon line. If you only have a hard GND or a reverse GND, and there are foreground elements crossing the horizon, it's gonna leave a mark on that part. If you have a soft GND, it also kind of works for those situations, though the hard GNDs are better. But generally, if you have a protruding element on the horizon, it's not gonna leave that mark where the hard stop is. So the more universal ones are the soft GNDs, of course, and it's obvious why you should get a soft GND as your first filter. So there, I hope you learned a lot from answering these questions. And there are some that I wasn't able to answer. If I wasn't able to answer your questions, I probably will answer personally, or if not, maybe another video is coming for that. But generally, I hope this was of big help. If you have any further questions, the comment section is open. And again, if you have not watched the first video, it explains a lot about filters that could really help you bridge that learning curve. In any case, thanks for watching, and if you haven't subscribed, click that button and share this video with some of your friends who might be interested in these topics as well.